Well, our gospel passage today starts has these really interesting two verses in it, right, about the uprooting of the tree. And I don't know about you, but I mean, that today suggests to me that we as a church have a pretty fantastic business opportunity. I mean, God has given us as Christians faith, right? And so we have a bright future ahead of us in tree removal and transplanting, right? I mean, Jacob's Well landscaping, I think it has a ring to it, right? We could go here. But actually, perhaps we should look at this the other way. I mean, maybe that passage really suggests that I at least don't have that much faith. I mean, because if I could just tell the weeds in my yard to get, and they would, but the tree sprouts, dandelions, burdock, and thistles are testifying against me, O ye of little faith. It's a funny thought, but if we read those first two verses of the gospel passage at the surface level, that's kind of where they leave us, right? Like, our gospel passage seems so simple. I mean, in one sense, even so moralistic. Have faith and do great things. Oh, and have a humble attitude towards God. Nothing more to see here. Move along, talk about something else. And it almost feels that way in the book of Luke because it is so segmented. It's like, and 2 verses about this, and 2 verses about this, and now a new topic. And it's just kind of like, okay, are we even talking about the same thing as we were talking about before? Like, what's going on here? But underneath the surface of our gospel passage, it's actually touching on deep things about our place as God's people in this broken and sinful world. And that theme is something that our other passages today are completely about. And they flesh it out in great detail. But to kind of show how these are connected, I need to start with what will appear at first to be an aside about botany. So here we go. The plants are coming back, folks. So, some of you guys recognized our plant from before. So the name, this is actually called a plantain plant. You guys have probably seen them in your yard. If you have not seen them in your yard, you've seen them in everybody else's yards because they're very good at spreading. And we have them on the church property. And they have lots of awesome, great properties that I could talk about because I'm kind of a nerd about this kind of stuff. But I'm going to leave it alone for now and just say this is a plantain plant, okay? Hello, everyone. I'm a plantain plant, okay? And this is a plantain, right? Does anyone see the problem here? Especially that these grow in bunches that are like 10 times bigger than this whole plant, right? Okay, plantain, same name, different plants, right? Okay. Well, how about this? Let's try to solve this from the other side, right? We have this plant. Who knows the name of this plant? Just shout it out. I hear horse apple. I hear hedge apple. I've heard both of those. Anyone know any other names? Osage orange. All right, so which is it, guys? Is it an apple or an orange? Right? Now this time, it's same plant, different names. Botany is confusing. And it's even more confusing when you're talking about ancient Greek botany. And we have a botanical problem in our passage today, and it's the word mulberry tree. Now, I have to kind of show my work here because there is debate about it, but the first thing to mention is that the Greek word that the ESV translates as a mulberry tree could also be translated, I went through the different possible translations, a mulberry fig, or a sycamore fig, or a sycamine tree, which is just alliteration, transcribing. They didn't even translate them. You'll find those, not typically in translations, but in the commentaries. And in fact, the word is a variant of the tree that 2 chapters later, or could be a variant, of the tree that 2 chapters later that Zacchaeus climbs, which is a what? He climbed up in a sycamore tree, right? Some of us remember that song from way back when, right? So there's different names for the same tree, potentially. But to add to the confusion, the word sycamore actually refers to 2 different trees. Because when you hear sycamore tree that Zacchaeus is climbing, it is not the gigantic tall tree we have here in Illinois. But he would probably break his neck trying to climb those. Have you seen them? They are not good climbing trees. Okay, it was this totally different kind of tree. In the Middle East, the tree that's known as a sycamore is about the size of a mulberry tree or of a hedge apple tree, if you know about the size of it. And yet, this sycamore in the Middle East bears figs. Are we lost yet? I mean, this is ancient Greek botany is tricky. But that's the kind of tree we should have in mind in our story. We should not be thinking of a mulberry tree. We should be thinking of a sycamore fig tree. Now, there's a little bit of debate on that. I've oversimplified the argument extensively. But that's about where I ended up. And I think the reason for going that way is that of thinking of this tree as being a larger variety of fig tree, essentially, is that Luke has a special interest in fig trees. He actually brings them up repeatedly in the gospel. And he's doing it especially likely as an adaptation of the material that he gets from the book of Mark. So just a few chapters earlier in Luke, Jesus is telling a parable about a vineyard owner who's debating about whether he should cut down the fig tree in his vineyard. You guys might be familiar with this in Luke 13. And he's saying, look, this tree, it only has leaves. I've been waiting for fruit for 3 years. All it has is leaves. You cut it down. Why should it use up the soil? Like, this is clearly a non-functional fig tree. Like, get rid of it. And his servant in that case says, no, wait. Just wait another year. I'll take extra good care of it. Maybe it'll grow fruit. But if it doesn't grow fruit after 4 years, sure, whatever. Cut it down. Get it out of here. We'll plant something else. And in Luke, this parable is Jesus' way of talking about the Jerusalem of Jesus' generation. He's saying that Jerusalem of Jesus' generation had failed to produce the fruit of righteousness that God had asked for from his people. They'd failed to become a community that represented God's character to the world. And God had patiently waited. He had cultivated them. But since they continued to be fruitless, Jesus warned them that they would be cut down if this kept going. So that's the first fig tree in Luke. I already mentioned we have a sycamore fig 2 chapters later with Zacchaeus. That one, by the way, is not even debated because it's like actually just the word for sycamore fig. This sycamine is like a variant of that word, so it's a little more tricky. But he climbed a sycamore fig tree. And then in chapter 21 of Luke, Jesus talks about the coming judgment of Jerusalem when they reject God's kingdom in Jesus. And there's this really weird thing where he could have just said, oh, and you know, when trees put on their leaves, and he doesn't say that. He's like, hey, and when fig trees put on their leaves, then you know that summer is here, and in the same way, judgment is coming when you see these signs. But my attention, the reason I kind of got hung up on mulberries or fig trees or whatever they are, is because I was actually more familiar with this passage in Mark where the same saying occurs in Mark 11. If you might have heard this too, and maybe it rings a bell for you. In Mark 11, Jesus talks about the little seed of faith allowing us to throw this mountain into the sea. So as I read this, I was like, what's up with that? Like, why did Mark's mountain become a tree? Like, this is kind of a strange move to make, Luke. But even more intriguing, Mark's Jesus in chapter 11 is talking about throwing this mountain into the sea while he's walking up to Mount Zion, that is, to Jerusalem. And so this mountain refers to a specific one. He's like, see this one here we are walking to? This mountain. It's not just a mountain or, it's this mountain. And he says this about throwing this mountain into the sea in his explanation to his disciples of when they noticed that he had cursed a fig tree and it had withered. So as I sat with this passage, I said, you know what's going on here is Luke has mashed up these images from Mark. He's taken the image of the fig tree being withered as a picture of judgment on Jerusalem, and he spins it as a parable first about a vineyard owner who with a fig tree that's not producing and is going to be cut down. And then in our passage, Luke calls that back to mind, but since, a normal fig tree is not very impressive for like uprooting, he decides to make it the big fig tree. So it's a little more like a mountain. So upon closer inspection, our passage too is somehow connected to this constellation of fig trees and judgment. Faith in Jesus somehow provides the context for the uprooting of Jerusalem of its day. The Jerusalem leaders who rejected Jesus are going to be uprooted. Judgment is right there in the image of uprooting. And if you think about it in an agricultural society, that makes perfect sense, because how long would you wait to see if your tree bore fruit before you decided, I should probably plant a different one? Right? And you're not going to uproot a tree that's bearing fruit. Right? The implicit thing is, if you're uprooting this tree, it's because the tree has a problem. Trees are valuable commodities. You don't just uproot them for no reason. How long before you cut it down or uproot it and start over? Well, how long is exactly the question that Habakkuk is asking in our rather confusing passage. It's especially confusing, I think it was on the screen, I didn't actually check, without the section headers, okay, which makes it really confusing because it's actually a dialogue between two people, and yet that was never announced in the passage. You can tell by the way they're using words, but like only if you're paying close attention. The beginning of it was Habakkuk complaining to God, like, there's so much injustice in our world. Like, people are just, like, justice is just not functioning in our society. Like, how long are you going to wait before you do something, God? It's kind of we're your people, right? Like, you should do something to fix all of this. Part one of the conversation. Then God comes in and he's like, yeah, okay, you know what? I am doing something. You said how long? The answer is now. I am currently working to bring justice. And here's how I'm going to do it. I'm going to bring the Babylonians. And this then turns to and then it describes them in great graphic detail of how epically terrible they are. To which Habakkuk then responds like, okay, like, really? Like, surely you're not going to like destroy our injustice with someone who's even worse than us? But I'll wait and see. I'll wait and see what you're going to do and what you're going to say to me. And then God responds, and we actually only get a teeny snippet of a response. It goes on in Habakkuk. But the key point of it is, it might seem slow, but justice is coming. The one who's puffed up will not be puffed up in pride forever. And the faith, those who believe, those who have faith, or the faithful ones, will live. The just will live by faith. It's another translation of that. It's interesting because this kind of, the prophet Habakkuk is saying, how long until you bring justice? But in some ways, that's the flip side of what we had in this original uprooting in Luke 13 or the cutting down of the fig tree, where the owner is saying, well, how long am I going to wait? And that adds a second layer to this tension. I mean, you look around, it's really easy to see that we live in a world where all sorts of injustices are done. You know, whether it's the global scene, our own society, or whether it's your living room, where I'm sure your sibling stole your toy. You kids know this, right? There is injustice in the world, from the biggest scale to the smallest. How long? How long will that last? But when we put it next to the fig tree parable, it adds a second dimension, because suddenly the fig tree is, it's the people of Israel in the parable, which is us, God's people. And so instead of it being like, how long till you deal with them over there, suddenly we realize God's saying, how long till I deal with you? We too have been unjust. Every sin we've ever committed has harmed somebody, right? Whether we know it or not. And so God's idly standing by, as Habakkuk, who gets away with talking to God that way, by the way? You are just idly standing by, right? His idly standing by, as he ascribes to God, by humanity's injustice against his beloved creatures, is at the same time God's patience before judging his beloved creatures. But how long can he wait in that tension? He loves justice. But then God's answer to Habakkuk's plea adds another level of disorientation. He's going to bring the Babylonians. They are the embodiment of power-worshiping idolaters. They come for violence. All their faces are forward. They gather captives like sand. At kings they scoff, and at rulers they laugh. They laugh at every fortress, for they pile up earth and take it. Then they sweep by like the wind and go on, guilty men, whose own might is their God. So Habakkuk is justifiably horrified. Why do you idly look at traitors and remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he? Surely you don't mean to do that, God? And yet that's exactly the same thing that Jesus is predicting in this judgment on the fig tree. The Israelites in Jesus' day were under judgment for using violent rebellion to get free from Roman power, all the while taking advantage of, or at least ignoring, their own poor and needy. But surely the Romans are worse than that, right? Like that's, you could say that's not great to be that in Israel, but like the Romans, they go around and they just like kill everybody. Like during the siege of Jerusalem, which actually did eventually destroy Jerusalem and uproot it from its place, there's a report the Romans crucified 500 Jews per day. That's worse, right? Like this is even worse than what was already happening in Jerusalem. The Romans too came for violence, piled up earth to take fortresses. They were undoubtedly guilty men whose might was their God. And so then you're like, well then, okay, how long is God didn't put up with that? There's mystery here. And if we needed the reminder, we were just doing this whole cycle in the wisdom literature, and Job and Ecclesiastes remind us perfectly well that under the sun there is injustice after injustice. Violence follows violence. And honestly, that's kind of a fitting summary of the vast scope of human history, to be honest. From tribal turf wars to empire builders, from playground conflicts to workplace politics, every group seems to think that their hostility is justified. But they themselves find themselves the victim of hostility eventually. And what hope do we as God's people have in a world like that? Well, the psalmist David also wrestled with situations like this. In our psalm, he talked about the wicked plotting against the righteous and gnashing his teeth at him. The wicked draws the sword and bends the bow to bring down the poor and the needy, to slay those whose way is upright. And later on in our psalm, David speaks of a wicked, ruthless man prospering and spreading himself like a green tree. That was not in our reading today, but it's later in the psalm. You can find it for yourself. Now, given David's background as a warrior king, I mean, you would think that his first reaction to this kind of threats is like, bring it on. Like, I'm here to kick butt in God's name. Like, this is, by my sword and the power of the Lord, these guys are going down, right? That's kind of what you might think of if you think about the life of David, right? Which makes it all the more surprising that in the face of these realities, David's counsel is not to dive in and fix all those evil people over there. His advice is don't fret. Now, I'm not sure about you, but that sounds to me about like the weakest advice you could possibly give in the face of the injustice of the world, right? Oh, just don't fret about it. Like that's like nothing. What is that going to do? How can that be the response? It's simple and simplistic. It won't make a difference in the world, will it? But not fretting is actually a lot more complicated than it sounds. And you can realize this if you just take a minute and think about your last week, right? I know that I can think about my last week and I could probably come up with a list that is more than 20 items long of the different ways that I fretted just this week. I fretted about the dirt arriving out there. I fretted about volunteers coming. I fretted about this sermon. I fretted about all sorts of things. I could go on and on. Fretting just characterizes our lives whenever we approach suffering from a merely human perspective. It's just the natural way to do it. And there is plenty to fret about, right? Like, it's not like we all live in a bed of roses, which honestly, beds of roses, I'm not sure why that's a saying. Like, roses have thorns. Who would want to live in a bed of roses? This would give you plenty to fret about if you lived in a bed of roses, right? But we all have plenty. Health issues, relational conflicts, like stress about our jobs. Like, there is so much to fret about. And that doesn't even mention the chaos in the world. Like, this is just our little teeny lives. Not to mention the injustices that this stuff is actually all about. What have you fretted about recently? David insightfully links fretting to envy. And this was really, I sat with this for a while. But I realized that when I fret, part of what I'm saying is, I wish I had the power that the people who are messing up my situation have. I wish I had the ability to solve this problem. There's a lot of envy in fretting. I wish I could control it. But there can also be a lot of anger, right? He says, refrain from anger and forsake wrath. Fret not yourself, it ends only in anger. When has your fretting turned to anger or wrath? How has your fretting ended in evil? How is mine? In some ways, fretting is actually the foundation of this violence and conflict cycle we were talking about earlier. Rather than solving the problems, fretting actually perpetuates it by priming our souls for a posture of antagonism towards others in the world. But David and Habakkuk together point us to a reason that we don't need to fret. Despite all appearances, God has promised to provide salvation and justice. We shall not die, Habakkuk says, even with the catastrophe of the Babylonians hanging over him. And while Habakkuk hears the Babylonians who laugh at fortresses, David has God as his stronghold and declares, the Lord laughs at the wicked, for he sees his day is coming. In just a little while, the wicked will be no more. But the meek, in another verse it says, those who wait for the Lord shall inherit the land and delight themselves in abundant peace. Commit your way to the Lord. Trust in him, and he will act. Be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. Be content with the little the righteous have. And that doesn't just mean wealth. Be content with the little wealth. Be content with the little power. Be content with the little prestige. Be content with the little honor. Be content with the little the righteous have, rather than joining the struggle to share in the abundance of the wicked. This is the alternative to fretting and to violence. Faith in the faithfulness of God, trusting that he, in his infinite wisdom, will steer the course of our lives and of history towards a satisfactory conclusion for both us and the world. Faith in his promises. But what kind of faith do we need for this? To have faith like a mustard seed. Now, to have faith like a mustard seed in Luke, the way he actually words it is slightly different from where it occurs in the other Gospels. To have faith like a mustard seed isn't first and foremost about having just a little bit of faith. It's not about size. It's not about amount, but about effect. To have faith that acts like a mustard seed. To have faith that grows and produces major effects despite its humble beginnings. Earlier in Luke, Jesus explained that the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, that although small, grows to be a tree. And faith in God's kingdom is like that. It's trust in God's salvation that allows us to turn our backs on the world's means of accumulation and control. I don't have to try to get things for myself because God's kingdom will give me everything that I need, whether in this life or the next. I don't have to get everything. I don't have to accumulate the power and control to fix my world. Because fixing the world is God's business. One that we get to join him in, true, but not one that we have to steer. And that kind of faith has effects in the world that grow over time. A community of faith like that grows up as a new tree, a renewed people of God that does bear fruit. It doesn't use up the soil. How might we as a community learn to live in light of God's goodness to us and of the goodness he promises to us? Well, it might look like trusting in the Lord and doing good, dwelling in the land and befriending faithfulness. Or it might look like St. Francis. Think about the way that St. Francis renounced wealth and power. He renounced the world's way of trying to steer his life and the universe. And he said, no, I'm going to commit to a way of life that seeks the good of others without seeking to control. And this is part of what the parable of the bondservant or the slave is about in the second part of the Luke passage. We as God's people are called to trust and faithfully obey our master. Now the parable is actually rather offensive to modern sensibilities if you look at it closely. The hierarchy of this passage is just rank. But the pervasiveness of status in their society was such that Jesus could assume that even his disciples would treat their slaves in this way if they had them. They don't have them because they don't have money. But they would if they could. Right? He says, which of you, if you had a slave? And they're like, oh yeah, that's what I'd do. Right? That's the way the parable works. He's bringing them along with him. And that isn't to justify the oppressive system that's in play here. But it is to say that that's the system that's assumed for the point of the parable. That's just how it is in their world. But the point of the parable is that in their society, the servant had no claim on the kindness of the master. The idea of human rights is nowhere in this ancient world context. It's that they have no right to claim kindness. They just have to do what they're told. And no amount of fretting would have done a first-century slave any good. Instead, the only thing they could do was to trust that their master would eventually give them what they needed, even if it seemed painfully slow in coming, while you're serving food to him and you have not eaten yourself. And it's crazy that Jesus uses this and asks us to imagine our relationship with God in a parable that's so conflicted and like that. To be honest, it's not a comforting picture of God, right? This is not a comforting way to picture God. The only real obvious benefit is that it puts a really clear, axe to the tree, to borrow a metaphor from earlier, an axe to the tree of the prosperity gospel that some people are going to pull from that mustard seed thing, right? Some people are like, hey, if all you need is that little bit of mustard seed, and then you get whatever you want. Name it and claim it, folks, right? All you need is that little bit of faith, right? And he's like, let's say no, because you are entitled to nothing, right? At least it puts the lie to that. We are unworthy servants, Jesus says. We should think. Unworthy servants, undeserving of God's kindness, even when we have done everything God commanded. Right? If you do everything right, you should be blessed, right? That's one of the perspectives out there. And he's like, hey, look, you did everything right, and guess what? You're still unworthy. You're not going to get a bunch of power by living an awesome life. This is not what's going on here. You're not entitled to this. But all that aside, it isn't a comforting story. But honestly, if you pay close attention to Jesus' words, they are often rather uncomfortable. And so are Habakkuk's words, and so are the Psalms' words that we were reading. If we pay attention to the delay of justice, all of this is rather uncomfortable. But thankfully, Jesus gave us more than a story. He gave us himself. And honestly, if that were not true, our attitude as servants towards God as our master would probably only be fretting and fear, not trust. But instead, we come as servants into the master's house after a long day of working with sweat and tears in the field of the world, seeking to cultivate fruit on the often unfruitful trees that we encounter every day. We come in, and Jesus, our master, does for us exactly what he says the master would not do. Jesus does exactly what he says you masters would not do. Jesus says to us, "Come at once and sit at my table. I have prepared your supper. I have dressed myself to serve you, to bring you the food and drink of new and unending life." And what kind of master does that? Our master does that. Our master who loves us. And it's only on the strength of that love demonstrated in Jesus that we cannot fret. When we receive our life from his body and blood at his table, even though we are unworthy servants, we are inspired to have faith and not fret. And I mean inspired both in terms of giving us reason to trust, like, oh, like I can actually trust you because you aren't like that really nasty master in the story. You're actually loving and you're going to take care of us. Like, I can actually trust you. Okay, I have reason now. But I also mean inspired in terms of being breathed into by God, receiving his life inside of us so that we can bear the fruit of faithfulness while we wait patiently for his final salvation, even in the midst of his slow justice and the distressing situations of our world.